Hello friends, thank you for watching my channel Sleeping History ASMR. So today I want to talk about the Italian city of Pisa, and of course their famous tower. Pisa is a city full of history that dates back to pre-Roman times. Even if you take out the big elephant in the room, which is of course will be the centerpiece of my video today. And I'm going to flash up a picture of it, the famous Leaning Tower. I typically don't dig too much into architecture, but to me this is one of the most fascinating pieces of architecture in Italy, which makes it compete with among the most fascinating in the entire world. But first we need to take a journey to where it all started, and that was the Etruscan civilization in the Italian peninsula, which was the initial founding of the city. And I'm going to flash up a picture of Etruria, which was the pre-Roman civilization. And of course, Rome eventually absorbed their civilization and culture. So starting with the name of the city itself, Pisa. It is believed that the origin of that word is Etrurian. The word Pisa literally means mouth, and it's likely because of the location of the city, which is at the mouth of the Arno River. And I'm going to kind of point it out on this map here, and this is Pisa right here, and there's the Arno River. The Etruscan pre-Roman civilization rose into prominence as the present-day Tuscany area transitioned to the Iron Age. Etruscans may not have been the earliest inhabitants. Some legends indicate a possible Greek influence, but by 600 BC, the Etruscans were the most prominent culture. And I'm going to kind of point out on the map the whole geography of it, and you can kind of see Pisa is right here, and you have the Arno River and the sea right here. I'm going to point out some other interesting things around. You can kind of see some of the other city-states. I believe Genoa is located up here. You have Florence right here, Rome right here, and Venice would be located up here in this area. And then Milan is going to be located up in this general vicinity. So during the second half of 3rd century BC, Pisa became a naval base for Roman campaigns over in Sardinia, as well as southern Gaul, which is now France. So you can kind of see the location of Pisa made it really advantageous because it was easy to get to France from there. And then of course you had any kind of campaigns that were done in any of these islands out here. It was an easy base to sort of come out of. So a road was built between Rome and Pisa, which did allow better movement by land and sea, and also aided in any military advance that was heading north. So between 300 and 500 AD, when the Roman Empire was invaded by barbarians, Pisa became subject to being pirated and attacked by barbarians. These barbarians, unlike many who conquered other parts of Italy, did not take over Pisa in the same fashion. Likely it was due to the complexity of the river system of Pisa. There were periods of different invaders, including Germanic Lombards and Vikings over the next 300 years. And most of these were cultures that assimilated with present Pisan culture, in some cases even peacefully. But like much of the rest of Italy, their most formidable enemy arrived in the 8th century. So this enemy were called Saracens, who were of the Muslim faith. In some quarters they were also called Moors. After conquering much of Spain and North Africa, they began incursions along the Italian coast, which led eventually to a conquest of Sicily. Pisa, though, seeing this new threat, put together a fleet in 828 that was led by Bonifacio de Luca, the Marquis of Tuscany. The fleet was sent to North Africa, where they successfully defeated the Saracens. On a smaller scale than perhaps the British defeat of the Spanish Armada was several hundred years later, this did establish the Pisan naval tradition. This tradition was driven by a desire to be successful commercially, and by making their port a prominent one, they were able to do so. In spite of this growing naval tradition, the Saracens continued becoming a thorn in the side of the Pisan navy. This eventually led to Pisa being attacked in 1004. The Saracens had a decisive victory in that attack, destroying much of the city and taking some Pisans as slaves. But Pisa managed to survive and mounted a counteroffensive over the next decade. The success of this seemed to actually make Pisa stronger than ever. The city became economically self-sufficient and very much autonomous. This was during the era of the Italian city-state, where trade led to wealth and a bit of a golden age. The Saracens became distracted as well by the Normans, who had just invaded Sicily. The Pisans saw the situation as advantageous for them and decided to attack Palermo as well, which helped the Normans in their Sicilian conquest. So here's where we move into the age of architecture for Pisa, which includes their most famous cathedral and leaning tower. The victories and the growing prominence of Pisa led to the commission of something that would be a symbol of the triumph of Christianity. It was a great cathedral. The architecture was in the style known as Romanesque. Here are some pictures of the cathedral as it still exists today. You can see the marble that was used in the construction and how it added unprecedented beauty to the cathedral. Brichetto de Giovanni, a Tuscan architect, was the builder, and one architectural expert, John Ruskin, later said, "There is a sensation in every inch of it, and an accommodation to every architectural necessity, with a determined variation in arrangement, which is exactly like the related proportions and provisions in the structure of organic form." Unlike the cathedral, which was certainly a brainchild of the architect Brichetto, the famous leaning tower, which had an official name of a campanile, was anonymously constructed. There are several possible architects, but no record exists to point to anyone as a consensus favorite. There is, however, a story of how the tower was financed. The story goes that in 1172, a widow from Pisa named Berta di Bernardo left gold as part of her last will and testament for the purpose of purchasing stone for the building of the tower. The desire for the church to have its own bell tower was likely the inspiration, as this was a popular trend in church culture of the time. The tower's design, by essentially being a column of columns, ironically was meant to demonstrate stability. On August 9th, 1173, groundbreaking began for the tower. For hundreds of years, it was believed that the tower was the product of shoddy construction, but due to much analysis and review over the years, it was determined that there were other issues that were in play that caused the tower to lean. The digging for the foundation was dug to only a 3-meter depth. The foundation, once laid, was left to settle for several months, and by early 1174, the construction of the levels of the tower commenced. At the completion of the first level, there was a discovery that the foundation had slightly shifted to the north, which caused a correction to create a heavier section. This was no cause for concern, as similar corrections were not uncommon with any construction in the area at the time. So the work continued on the tower at a rate of 18 months per story, and by 1178 the tower was halfway built. All seemed to be going fine, and nothing was amiss at this point. But for some reason around this time, work on the tower stopped. Some believe that the ground might have been identified to be unstable, and the pause would hopefully strengthen the construction. Another theory indicates that the stone resources had been exhausted. Support for this theory seems to be backed up by the fact that the stone quality decreases the higher in the tower you go. Whatever the case, it seems to be that the construction was halted for nearly 100 years. But perhaps the most plausible theory is that Pisa itself was in decline. Other Italian city-states had been competing with them in trade. Enemies were numerous. The Pisan fleet suffered a defeat at the hands of the Venetians, which led to a loss of trade privileges with Constantinople. Also, their territory of Corsica was forced to be ceded to Genoa. In 1272, construction continued. The new architect Giovanni di Simone was eager to begin work. Simone noticed the half-finished tower was shifting to the south. Some suggested that Simone adjust the look of the tower into a more Gothic look, which would have resulted in a curved shape. But Simone was determined to stick to the plan. One other option he had was to build the upper levels thinner, which would have relieved pressure on the foundation and soil below. Unfortunately, Simone eventually died before the construction could be completed. To make matters worse, Genoa threatened Pisa with 88 ships. The Pisan navy scrambled to protect the port, but Genoa routed Pisa, killing 5,000 and imprisoning 11,000. This was the end of the era of the Pisan navy. Genoa was victorious, and their spoils included the islands of Corsica and Sardinia, and Genoan traders were exempt from taxes on their goods in Pisa and its territories. Fortunately, the church and monuments in Pisa were spared. Work was being done around the cathedral, and it was close to being completed. So finally they were able to turn their attention to finishing the tower. Some were pushing for the tower to be dismantled, so a commission was called to debate the fate of the tower. The commission did much testing by dropping weighted lines on the exterior and interior to test the stability. In spite of the obvious tilt, they determined that it was stable, but the commission made some errors and did not recognize the structure's biggest flaw, its excessive weight. It put a huge load on the terrain, which was soft and unstable, but the belfry of the tower was still not completed, which would present the biggest issue whenever it was eventually completed. So by 1350, the tower was completed. Tommaso de Andrea was commissioned to finish it. In addition to completing the belfry, he also added some structural integrity by varying the steps to the belfry on the north side to have 2 less steps. The tower was finally completed in all its crooked glory. We will come back to the tower in a moment, but it's worth mentioning that 200 years later, after the building of the tower, the most famous Pisan was born on February 15th, 1564. Of course, that famous Pisan was Galileo. His family was originally from Florence. His father, a composer, established a school of music in Pisa, which was not an overwhelming success. But by fall of 1581, Galileo enrolled in medical school. This was the intellectual foundation for what Galileo would become, as he learned complex mathematics. Unfortunately, Galileo's educational funding ran out, and he had to leave medical school. Eventually, Galileo ended up in Florence. In Florence, some of Galileo's writings on gravity gained popularity, and Galileo got a teaching job in mathematics at the University of Pisa. From 1589 to 1591, Galileo taught in Pisa. According to one biographer, Galileo conducted experiments from the Tower of Pisa to demonstrate that objects dropped had a time of descent that was independent of their mass. Most believe that this story is based on legend, as the same experiments had already been done by others prior to that, and there's nothing that Galileo published during that time to indicate anything about the experiments. He is thought to have simply just taught students mathematics during this time. But this legend by a biographer of Galileo added to the lore of the tower and made the picture of Galileo dropping things from the tower a compelling story to be repeated for centuries, as it was repeated as fact. Over the centuries after the Italian city-states became a united Italy, Pisa remained a city that was less thriving than its days of a trade mecca. The tower remained as a reminder of what it once was, but it did gain notoriety, and some had concluded that the tower was designed with flaws on purpose. While this of course was untrue, it did add to the mystique, but in spite of all this, there never seemed to be a concern about the structural issues eventually causing a collapse. Ironically, it would take the collapse of a bell tower many miles away to make people realize that there was a potential issue with this tower, because in 1902, in the city of Venice, a collapse of a bell tower occurred. Ironically, this collapse was likely the thing that saved the Leaning Tower of Pisa. This brought forth an effort from the Italian government to study and get recommendations to save the tower. After a 3-year study, it was determined that the movement of the tower over the years put it in danger, where a single earthquake could topple it. But there weren't any practical solutions to fix the issue. By the 1930s, dictator Benito Mussolini was firmly in power. One of his acts as dictator was to authorize a plan to inject cement into the tower's foundation. For over a year, liquid cement was pumped into the base of the tower. The idea was to block the movement of water. After this attempt, the tower was watched closely to see if any improvement was made. Actually, the movement of the tower got worse, moving millimeters, but eventually the movement stopped in exactly the same place that it was before, and no more stable than it was before the effort began. During World War II, German and Italian Axis troops saw the advantageous terrain of Pisa and attempted to use it for fortifications. By summer of 1944, Allied troops were advancing into Italy. The Axis was able to somewhat slow this advance, and Allied attempts to take Pisa was very difficult due to the terrain. Germans were able to shell the Allies with accuracy, and it became apparent that they were pinpointing their attacks by observing Allied movements from the top of the Leaning Tower. The U.S. Army was told to destroy it, but right as Sergeant Charles King was about to give the order, the Axis advanced towards their position, which prevented the destruction. But eventually, on September 2nd, 1944, the Allies took Pisa, and in spite of loads of destruction all around it, the Leaning Tower stood tall. Post-war, there were several more commissions that met trying to save the tower from imminent destruction. No solutions had been found, but another event demanded a solution when in 1989, the Civic Tower in Pavia fell, killing 4 people. The next year, the Italian government closed the tower due to concerns that it could be the next thing to collapse. More studies and more commissions followed, and in 1995, work began to install stabilizing cables, which had the unlikely side effect of nearly collapsing the tower. Ultimately, by 1999, a solution presented itself. It was decided that the best solution, while expensive and time-consuming, was to use computer models to start a process of gentle soil extraction. The tower gently moved by 5 millimeters, thus stabilizing it, and the 60 tons of soil that were extracted and replaced by more stable soil is believed to have bought the famous Leaning Tower of Pisa another 300 years. The stabilization of the tower saved the icon and simultaneously the tourism industry in Pisa, which is still one of the most visited sites in Europe. Thank you for watching, and thank you for subscribing to my channel, and we'll see you next time.